So welcome back, everybody, to another webinar organized by Princeton for everyone worldwide. We're very happy to have Leonard Wantchekon with us. Hi, Leonard.
Hi.
Leonard is my colleague here at Princeton and also the founding president of the African School of Economics. And he will talk about the externalities of colonial schools in Africa. So we will learn a lot about Africa today and hopefully about the educational system as well. So let me just give a few opening remarks before I pass on the floor to Leonard. So I just wanted to show some striking figures about the development of Africa in economic terms and also in demographics, and to highlight the challenges we are facing there. So one, I think, is we in economics know relatively little how really economic growth works. And one striking fact is that, certain parts of the world grow much more rapidly than other parts. And what I've depicted here is just the growth of South Korea versus the Ivory Coast, as picking just one country in Africa. And you see in the 60s and the 70s, even the early 80s, Ivory Coast and South Korea had roughly the same GDP per capita in both countries. But then, South Korea took off and now they have about 15 times a higher GDPs than the Ivory Coast. And that's actually striking. And the question is, what growth model will help us to make Africa grow as fast as South Korea? And what worked, of course, in South Korea was the expert-led growth model, very much focused on exporting things and learning through expert. We have seen this earlier in a webinar Arminio Fraga gave more than a year ago on Brazil, where he also very much argued that the only growth model we really know which really works is the expert growth model. So that's, showing the potential we still have, and, just looking what South Korea did, and perhaps there's some elements one could copy there. Of course, South Korea also suffered from colonialism and was run over by Japan and China all the time. And so they also had a very hard history behind them. Now, the other challenging factors is the demographics. If you look at the demographics of the sub-Saharan Africa, so all the southern part of Africa below the Sahara, you see that the population will grow very rapidly to more than 4 billion people. So in 2100, we will have more than 4 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa. That's a huge challenge to have this extreme growth in population. Of course, you might say there might also a young generation coming up with a lot of young potential entrepreneurs, and all this is also an opportunity. But it might also, if the growth is not coming, if economic growth is not coming, this might lead to huge migration pressures and perhaps potentially to social unrest. And so what really is needed, we have to figure out a way to generate economic growth in Africa. That's actually just for political safety reasons. And Leonard is also a political scientist, so he can talk about economics and politics. And we hope we will learn something about education. And one hope, of course, is new technology and perhaps new institutions. So in education, and Leonard will talk probably about the African School of Economics, what difference he wants to make to Africa through that school. The question is, through technology, does it help to have online learning? Is there a way to expand this and scale it up much more? Or is it, did we learn all the shortcomings of online learning during the COVID crisis? But what are the potentials there? And what other new institutions and governance structures technology can help us through fintech, digital money, or big tech platforms? Is there any way to drive this? But today we will talk much more about the education and the roots, going back to the roots of the education earlier, how long-lasting impacts it has or did not have on the current educational environment and the current situation on the ground. Now, Leonard also submitted certain poll questions. So here are the answers you gave to this poll question. The first one was, the educational expansion in colonial Africa, was it by a large extent demand-driven, yes or no? And the answers were roughly 1/3 said yes and 2/3 said no. So 1/3 thought it was demand-driven. We will learn from Leonard whether you were right. The second question was, in colonial Africa, do shocks to income have a stronger long-term impact on social mobility than shocks to aspiration? So that's a shock to income or shocks to aspiration. What has a stronger impact on social mobility? And shocks to income have a stronger impact. That's 76%. That 3/4 said it's roughly shocks to income, which have a bigger one, and only 25% said shocks to aspiration. We will again learn from Leonard whether that's right or not. And the third question was, what areas should African governments focus on? Should they focus much more on access to basic education, vocational training to improve the employability, or higher education and research? And the answers to that question were from you. The survey questions was about 78% for basic education, 19% for vocational training, and only 3% for higher education and research. So you see a strong leaning towards basic education rather than vocational training, and higher education almost very few said that's there should be the priority. So with this overview, I pass on the floor to Leonard, who will enlighten us and probably will get to different conclusions after his talk for these questions. Thanks again, Leonard. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Such a pleasure to be here, and I like the introduction, which set the stage quite well. Now, the other side of the story is that the past 20 years, the average GDP per capita of Africa has doubled. And there is a sense in which there is an increased degree of convergence between Africa and the rest of the world. So there is hope. Now, so I'm going to be talking about my research program on colonial schools. It's a program that's started from just a very simple casual observation. I was really, during a conversation with my brother, I was stunned by how much success my home village had in placing students from my generation to graduate school. So in a population of like 40 kids from my generation, 13 has PhDs. And I started thinking about the proximity of the first colonial school set up there in 1895. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. And then try to explore the mechanism, particularly thinking about the influence that the early educated has on the non-educated, and how the choice that were made afterwards were shaped, not only by the existence of the school, but also how the school spread very quickly, geographically, but also across generation. So let me also say that since then, the project has really grown. It's now a research program that 12 years running and benefited hugely from the infrastructure of the African School of Economics. And African School of Economics, that set up in 2014, has now campuses in Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, in Nigeria. We even have a joint degree program in South Africa. We placed about 34 students in PhD for the past 5 years. So it's a major research institution today in Africa. And the testament to the strength of this institution is actually this project. Okay. So I'm not going to focus on one particular paper. I'm going to talk about mostly two papers that I've written on Benin, and one in QJ, the other one is on the review, and then two others that are working papers, basically on Nigeria, but then there are other ones on Brazil, and Brazil in particular, Brazil and Benin, that and other type of other similar projects that I'm currently conducting. So what I'm going to tell you about is a program more than a paper. So, okay, let me start with motivation. So, research is driven, development is driven in large part by human capital, and there is evidence that it persists, but there is more and more pressure to uncover mechanisms of persistence, not just to say that investment lasts, but have long-lasting effect, but also try to understand the various mechanisms through which you have persistence. There is also recent literature on social mobility that's focused on externalities, reduced form neighborhood effects by Cherry, Alessina, and others. But then again, it's unclear what the mechanisms of social mobilities really are, you know. So another line of literature is in education. Education, booming research program, macro, micro, but it's all almost exclusively focused on supply, less on the formation of demand. But in fact, the demand can be, I mean, I'll show in a second, the demand was actually a key factor in explaining education expansion in conditions of very, very limited, very, very, very suppressed you know, investment by colonial administration, you know, from all across, I mean, from early 20th century to the 60s and 70s in some countries. And also it's really important to study demand so that we can see to what extent stimulating aspiration, stimulating parental investment, which are all part of demand, can actually make a big difference.
Here you talk about higher education, or you talk about vocational training, or all of the parts of it?
Yeah, I'm talking about all, but then but in colonial Africa is mostly basic education, you know. So and I'm going to actually respond to some of the questions about that come out in the poll for a second. But I mean, okay, but the goal here is basically to describe the extent of which education contributed to mobility in Africa during the colonial times, using micro evidence from Benin, and there is preliminary evidence from Nigeria as well. But then not only to describe the extent of mobility, but also the mechanism. And I'm going to talk about a wide range of mechanisms, illustrate them. So I'm going to get that in a second. So, and for that, I'm using a quasi-experimental design, studying the cohorts who live close to a first primary school, the very first one set up across Benin, in particular, 100 to 180 years ago. And then the focus will be on spillover within and across generations. So the question then is, how did colonial school contribute to social mobility in the first 3 generations, from, you know, mids to late 19th century to today? What were the mechanisms? There are several that will pop up during the presentation. One is occupation diversity, income, aspirations, redistributive social norms, like within family transfer, political participation, for instance, places where you have high level of education, you have an incentive to participate and to demand education as a result. And life outlook, work ethics, like some of the behavioral mechanisms for mobility, you know, like individuals who have positive attitude will more likely to invest in their own mobility. So the preview of the results, and that's you'll find this quite surprising in light of the polls. So education has led to large and persistent shift away from subsistence agriculture. So structural transformation to some degree have been shaped by education in places where schools were created. Now, there were impressive, I should say, massive education and income mobility across 3 generations. Surprisingly, it was driven in large part by aspiration, less by income. Because the grandchildren of the educated living near a school, I mean, the grandchildren of uneducated individuals living near a school did better than those of the educated. And I'm going to show that in a second and explain, you know, with a lot of examples why this was the case. So there were also significant family and village externalities, because this, when you look at the second generations, the village treated individual, that those who were indirectly educated, meaning they just happened to live near a school, and someone who was educated, they had better outcome than those in controlled villages where there was no school and no one had been to school. Now, there's a major decrease in inequality when from the first to the second generation, as the descendants of the educated and the uneducated, has similar, level of income. And I found where there is evidence that there are transfer within families, like for instance, uncle helping nieces. And that's one of the driver of educational externalities and the reduction of educational inequality. And the village level externality were partly run by grandparents' aspiration, meaning the social networks and the different set of externalities that happen because of the proximity to a school, proximity to somebody who has been to school. We show that this was one of the key drivers of mobility, okay? So, and we also find that mobility in the third generation is sustained by positive attitude. So we find correlation between the slope of mobility and, more self-reliance, work ethics, and positive life outlook. And there are three major contributions that this program has to the literature. One is social mobility. It's a growing literature showing where the opportunities are, where, describing some kind of a map of social mobility in US, in Africa, and India for some of the recent papers. What we are using here is a historical micro approach, not big data, but sample of individuals connected across generations so that we can really unpack the mechanism of mobility. The second is education and supply. As I said earlier, there is focus on supply, but here the key driver of education expansion and mobility is the fact that people want it. The fact that people haven't seen a neighbor, haven't seen the success and the mobility of individuals who were educated. They not only did the same, but push their children, to actually, be educated and be successful. So, and then another important literature that, we are contributing is the discussion between human capital institution, what is the main driver, economic development, colonial economic development. The focus of this paper will be on human capital, and I have enough evidence, particularly in places where there's some variation in institutional, capacity, and we show that, in fact, human capital was really the key driver, particularly because of the strength of externalities, how powerful, the spillover were, spatially and across generation, okay? So another important contribution is the methodology. As you can see in a second, very careful micro level study that's parallel Townsend and Kabowski's work in Thailand. Okay, so
can I ask, because there's some questions coming in. So David Ennis would like to know, does it apply to publicly financed schools or also privately financed schools? Do you make a distinction between the two?
No, the earlier school were Catholic school and public school.
And did it make a?
No, there was no much difference. I mean, obviously, there was one Catholic school in the sample, and for instance, like they were more likely to take position as religious teachers, and the curriculum was a bit different, less focus on general education, general curriculum, but more on religious curriculum. So there are some nuances, between Catholic and public school. But by and large, the effect on income, the effect on education attainment and social networks, not only within, but across generation, were very, very similar.
Did you do it for French colonies versus British colonies? Is there any way one can distinguish, given Acemoglu's work on, it matters a lot too?
Exactly. So the study in Benin was, Benin is a French colony, but we're currently doing that in Nigeria, which is a British colony. And, yeah, so I think we'll be able, very soon, maybe in a year or two, to be able to do a systematic comparison between colonial, between French and British colonies, and but the earlier results in Nigeria show strong similarities, So, okay, I'm going to say a few words about the theoretical conceptual benchmark. The story here is, the appropriate model to tell the story here is one that basically show how human capital investments affect inequality. You have two papers here, and the prediction of those two papers is that initial gap in investments will persist across generation and will make credit constraints and inability to invest, to enhance skills, will make inequality actually worse. So poor families will be at a strong disadvantage. So it's a model that really put a lot of emphasis on income differences, income gap as a driver for educational, for educational inequality. Okay, but then what I'm going to show here is that this inequality can be mitigated if, for instance, we consider social networks. For instance, if poor individual lives near, connects, and in the same network as wealthy individual, wealthy educated individuals, they might have a higher demand for education, high aspiration, and this might mitigate the result on education creating inequalities. You also have a general equilibrium effect where uneducated can benefit from labor market opportunities, provided by the educated. You can also have transfer from the rich to poor people within the same family, the same neighborhoods. This is an important component of African culture. And then political participation. For instance, when there is school, there is high demand. Demand generates political entrepreneurs, politicians who will push for educational expansion. And there are a lot of examples throughout Africa. Even the early early post-colonial African leaders invest and push very hard for educational expansion, not only towards the end of the colonial rule, but also early post-colonial period. Okay, so I'll try to show you that, to try to illustrate the design using an example, basically to try to convince you that the selection of the location and the selection of the first cohorts was quasi-random.
So Leonard, can I ask another clarifying question?
Yeah.
You said the big effects are for the grandchildren. What about the children? You look at them too, or there's not such a big effect?
I'm sorry, say it again.
You said the grandchildren, they have a big social mobility increase.
Yeah.
The grandparents went to school.
Yeah.
What about the children? Do they benefit from that too?
It's you have big effect on the second generation, but then much bigger effect on the third generation.
And you will explain why it takes 2 generations to.
So I'll show you in a second is that what is fascinating is that at the third generation, the grandchildren of the uneducated living near a school, they did better they have higher level, which is something that you cannot predict. You know, I mean, it's hard to understand that, but it's hard to understand why it could be an advantage for a third generation to be descendants of non-educated living near uneducated. You know, and I think this is not something that might travel to other countries, to other contexts, and the specificity of African culture, you know, extended family culture, and intra-family transfer, you know, all those factors might explain, you know, this kind of counterintuitive finding, you know. So, yeah. So it's
also explain. Typically, the family sends only 1 or 2 boys to school. You know, it's not everybody is sent to school if there are 5 kids in the family.
Yeah.
How's the selection? Is this important? Whom you send to school?
Yeah. So, in fact, as I'm going to show in a second, the first generation, enrollment was very small and near random, you know, because I select places where there was no European settlement. So people who went to the school did not know, you know, did not have much information about the value of Western education. You know, in fact, there were many of the kids were actually, you know, taken more or less by, I'm not saying by force, but, you know, because actually what is interesting in Africa, in Nigeria, and also in Benin, is that children of wealthy individual, upper class, they did not go to school because the parents who were upper class, they were viewing Western education with suspicion. And so in fact, it's children came from lower class, you know, and at some time it's the weaker or the less healthy kids who were sent to school early. You know, a kid who cannot go to the farm is just given up to the mission schools. It's 5 or 6 cohorts later, when those kids became successful, because many of them were hired as a teacher or nurse or translator, even from 6th grade and 5th grade, that parents started sending their kids to school voluntarily. So the selection issues will come up in the 2nd generation or less in the 1st generation. Yeah. Anyway, thanks. So the story here is that, okay, I'm going to tell you a story about how the school in my home village, Zainando, was created. So to illustrate that site selection were near random. So those 2 missionaries, you know, one from Indiana, not close to Notre Dame, a place called Vincennes, and Pichot from Marseille, they joined forces to come to, you know, to the current day Benin, and wanted to explore the source of a river. And when they went, they tried to avoid, you know, some area where there was a colonial war happening, and went to my home village, San Girando, and they nearly died. But this is from their memoir, by the way. So they nearly died. So they were held by the locals, went back, and Vatican sent them back to the place. And as a gift for the community, they set up a school. And this is the school in session. And randomly they selected 33 kids, you know. So that's about site selection, you know. So there is nothing about Zainando, where I was born, that makes it more suitable to have a school than the village 20 kilometers away, you know. Okay, those are, okay, anyway, so that's one point. The second point is that after, you know, okay, I didn't want to make this project like one location. So I wanted to think about similar locations across the country with similar characteristics, where, no, like very limited exposure to Western, to Western education and no European settlement, and made me select places that are 100 kilometers inland. So, so you can consider this place as being exposed to European institutions prior to the creation of the school. And here, no European institution prior to the creation of the school. So I was able to select 4 places. It is very interesting because this place, Zainado, the school was set up by missionaries. This one was selected, was actually set up after a railroad station has been, created. This one, it was after colonial conflict. This one has a Muslim area. So it's interesting because all the 4 locations that's part of the study have very unique characteristics. Okay, so, and this is about selection. So this is about site selection. Now, what about student selection? So what we did is that we only selected the first 3 cohorts using archival, admin, church record, and interviews of descendants of those children. What is interesting, those students. Okay, so that's the group we call treatment 1. Treatment 2 are people living in the village who have not been to school. So since there is no record of that, we use something called backward sampling, like using the current generation to sample the generation from the past. So, so we have treatment 2, being created this way, meaning people living near a school but did not go to school. So that's what we call treatment 2. Now, there are 2 types of treatment 2, because you might be in a village where it's close enough to the school, but no one from that village had been to school. We call that treatment 2 type 2. And treatment 2 type 1 is when there is at least one person who has been to school. So I'm just not only considering the proximity to the school, but also the existence of the social networks in which someone is educated. So the control village, same story. So we went to the place, look at, had a sample of people over 40, whose grandparents or parents, 40 to 60, like parents, may have the same age cohorts as those who have been to a school. And we asked about their grandfather if the age confirmed by, several, like confirmed by, for instance, when they die and their birth record, if they have the same age cohort as those from T1, then they are part of the group. So,
but you don't look particularly at siblings, no? You could look at one.
Yes, I'll get to the sibling in a second.
Okay.
I'll get to the sibling in a second. Okay, so we do social demographic survey and so on. Okay, now another thing that we did is, for instance, we make by looking at the family, we look at sibling. So for each of them, we have a list of their sibling, and then we sample the sibling, so that we can look at within family externalities, and we look at the children of each sibling, so that we can have nephew and nieces, and then we always sample about seven of them, and we make sure that there is a proportionality. For instance, depending on how many girls and boys, we have to sample appropriately. And for instance, if it's a polygamous family, we make sure that in the sample we have, children from each wife is represented. So as a result, we have, for the first generation, we not only have educated, non-educated near a school, non-educated without a school, we have sibling, okay? Now, second generation, we have children, we have nephew and nieces, and so, and obviously this is for each group, for T1, we have children, nephew and nieces. For T2, we have children, nephew and nieces as well, control children, nephews and nieces as well, you know. So, so this is, for instance, an example of a map, for instance, of Kandi, you know, like village here are treatment, these ones are control, and this village, for instance, might have somebody who has been to school, that treatment 2 type 1, you know, this might be no one, treatment 2 type 2, you know, anyway. So this is same map for my, for Zainado, when I was born, and you know, I show a table that show that, you know, the strategy worked very well because the different villages are balanced, unobservable. And it's very similar to similar to an exercise that Dell and Oakland have done in studying the long-term impact of factories set up by, you know, by the Dutch, I think, in Indonesia. Okay, here's a list, for instance, of the first cohorts, you know, so they look quite similar, you know. So this is the first 2 cohorts in Zainado. This picture was taken in 1897. So this is an archival stuff, you know. So, and the story is also personal. I mean, because, for instance, my uncle was T1, he went to school. My mom and my dad were T2, you know. I'm second generation, you know. This is when I was in 6th grade, you know. This is when I was in middle school, and more recently, somewhere in Boston, you know. So, you know what I'm getting to.
Yes.
So, but then, so in many cases, we're able to interview people who were in the school. So particularly in a school that was set up earlier, much later. So I was part of the interview for us in many places. This is one of my informant I was talking to, you know. Anyway, so the results for first generation, you see treated individual far less likely to be farmers, and untreated in village with school, they did better than the control here. Not much better, but still, okay? And you can see, for instance, that they pick up some French, perhaps, you know, they are not as well, in terms of social networks, they are not as well connected as those who are educated, but somehow, at least better than control, okay? Here's a picture, for instance, of first generation treated family. You know, you can see this is quite different from this family, from the same generation. And anyway, so let me now come to second generation. You know, you can see here that the gap has shrunk considerably in terms of education between treated and untreated with school. Now much higher, much better off education than the control. Far less likely to be farmers, you know. So, and social networks, much better, you know. So, and you know, this is the specific, you know, the economic specification on the table, you know. So you just tell the story I just described with the summary statistics. Okay, so in terms of living standards and wealth, same thing. This is, for instance, a second generation family. You know, this guy is the son of one of the people who was in the cohort that I show you. So that's a big difference, you know. Okay, so social ties, same story. Okay.
So can I just, for simplicity,
yeah.
If my parents went to school, how likely is it the kids go to school too? And did you look particularly the guys whose kids, so the parent went to school, but the kids did not?
Yeah, so there were cases, okay, let me put it this way. 2 things. First, some of the early educated families were very large.
Mm-hmm.
As a result, the first few kids tend to go to school and move, go quite far. The last one, much less. You know, the tendency is to have, in educated families, basically, an enrollment, a large level of enrollment, but a lot of inequalities because the family is large. Mm-hmm. Now, the untreated, they also tend to send all their children to school because, it's smaller family size, and they are credit constraints, for most of them, and sometimes when they work for an educated family member who has a shop, who has some investment, they even do much better. So, I think in those communities, the level of enrollment is relatively high. For instance, in my home village, the primary school enrollment rate in my home village was about 93% in the 60s. A village like 25 kilometers away, which is control, I would consider control, was 25%. You have massive inequality between treated villages and control. And then you have a very small gap between the uneducated living there and the educated living there, So, anyway,
did people stay in the village, or the educated were more likely to move away like you did, in a sense?
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's something that we took into consideration. So so the outcome of the second generation is not always realized where they were born. They were realized in the city or even outside the country, So, the new social networks around them where they move to is not something that we document. We just document their aggregate or their reduced form outcome when they leave the place, or whether they leave the place or not. It will be interesting, for instance, to look at the difference in achievement or in income and education level between those who stay and those who left for the same level of income or the same level of education, for instance. Look at income gap between those who stay back and those who leave. Yeah.
Francesco Franzoni has a question on the econometrics. Is there no risk of a selected sample of doing backward sampling? Specifically, families that survive to the present day might have more survival skills than families that are no longer around today. So he's worried about selection bias, essentially.
Okay, let me put it this way. We dealt with that by in a various way in the QJE paper, where we show that. Let me put it this way: there are if you map the different families in a typical African village in the 30s and 20s, it looks, at least in terms of mapping, it's similar to those who are there today. There is some degree of rigidity in, linked to, this is, you need to maintain, you need to maintain strong ties with the ancestors. So even when many people leave, someone has to stay back to actually keep the memory of the family alive. So as a result, there's not too much of a risk that some of the families that we selected, that some family that we have already seen that there is more likely that there's some likelihood some family might have disappeared and may have been missed from our sample, because of this kind of cultural threat of African communities, where it's very, it's almost difficult. It's difficult to imagine a situation where some family will have completely left the place. There is always somebody back. It's something that we check very, very closely, very, very carefully in the sampling strategy. Let's not forget that the methodology you use is very anthropological in a sense, because we have people staying there in the village for months and sometimes years to produce the information, the data that we have. So we try to make sure that the sample we have is as representative as possible. But anyway, more details about this, you know, we have some stuff on recall bias and migration. How we deal with that is in the paper. Yeah. Okay. So, so this is, you know, this shows, for instance, there is, you know, transfer within families. So as a result, niece and nephew, there is not much gap between achievement of the children of the educated and his nephew or nieces, you know. So an evidence that there was a strong intra-family transfer. Okay, so one element that we haven't documented like systematically, but which is kind of important, is that since I'm talking about family transfer, there are several ways. I'm sorry, like family externalities, there are several ways. One way might be aspiration, like in my case, I grew up pushed to be like my uncle, you know, who was very, very highly successful. And I was even nicknamed my uncle, you know, so use nickname after him. And but that's one way. A second way, redistribution, paying school fees, and sort of alleviate the financial constraints to sending kids to school. My uncle paid for our schooling completely. And also setting up family business, you know, and a lot of instances, for instance, where the educated member of the family set up a business and hire a brother or sister to work on that family. And we find evidence that, for instance, that siblings of the treated who own a shop are 20% less likely to be farmers, and the descendants tend to be more educated. And 40% of the descendants of educated shop owners have at least second school education compared to only 20% for those without shops. You know, it shows that entrepreneurial human capital has strong externalities than non-entrepreneurial, if you will. Okay, now let me now go to the third generation, which is really, you know, quite fascinating. So we compute transition matrices, and then focus on the three categories: the treated, the untreated without school. We untreated without school control and untreated with school. Okay, so there are several interesting findings here. So the first one is, if you look, and I think this answers partly the question that Markus asked earlier. So this is the second generation, okay? So if you are second generation and poor, you are 28% likely that the third generation will be poor if your parents are individually treated. But if you are second generation poor, you are only less than 12% that your third generation will remain poor. And what is interesting is that if you look at you know, likelihoods of placing descendants in middle class, you know, like 2, the untreated individual with school do better. You know, this is here you have basically 22%. If, I mean, 22 plus 32, and here 39 plus 31. You know, so, and even like upper class, like the likelihood that the untreated individual will place kids in the upper class, it's similar. The only instance where treated individual do better than untreated with school is the likelihood that they are going to place, the likelihood that high status or high class will place their third generation in high class. 85 versus 71. You know, so that's what I was saying earlier, that when your grandfather is uneducated, living near a school or having social networks where someone is educated, there is an initial aspiration shock, you know, like my mother, my father's aspiration shock, being linked to someone who is educated. And this has an impact on the second generation, you know, like me. But there's a momentum that carries to the third generation. And what is interesting is that the third generation might even do better in the, you know, untreated individual with school versus the treated individual with school, you know. And I think that's why this makes me say that income shock are less likely. Okay, let me put it this way. So the poll question that I asked was basically to try to capture this, and it's the opposite of what we should expect. That aspiration shock tend to have a much stronger long-term impact than income shock. You can say these guys have income shock, these guys have aspiration shock. Obviously, if you take into consideration the transfer, you know, it's a combination of aspiration and income, but still, it's mostly aspiration, you know. And
just to make sure I understand the tables correctly. So is it better? My grandfather lived in a village with a school.
Yeah.
But it's better than if my grandfather did not go to school. If my grandfather went to school, I'm less likely to do as well as some other kid whose grandfather did not go to school.
Yes, living close by.
Living close by. It's just living close by is better than having my grandfather having been to school.
Exactly, exactly. And there are several reasons for it. You know, for instance, your grandfather, because he went to school, he will tend to have a lot of kids. You know, because he's a superstar and so on. You have a lot of wives and family and so on. That's one. Second is that, and then the kids, for instance, a lot of inequality among the kids because the first one will be highly successful, and then the last one will not do really that well. And then, but then, you know, I can tell you stories after stories about how T2 individuals really motivate their kids based on the observation that education can make you very, very highly successful. You know,
do you have any evidence that the kids whose grandparents did not go to school but were close to the school are harder working, or they are more dedicated at school than?
Yes, yes. I mean, I have some evidence for that. I'm going to show you that in a second. Show that they have better work ethics, and they also have positive outlook. They have a better positive life outlook. Yeah. Okay. So clearly there is some empirical support for the fact that they tend to work much harder. You know, so and I think something that we tend to overlook when we are talking about African communities is, first of all, the value of being in the networks and the responsibility that the higher up individual have towards trying to help, trying to motivate the other ones. This is the extended family culture, but also the fact that, you know, like wealthy kids will take their parents' income and status for granted, you know, and, you know, while the non-educated, for instance, they will be reminded all the time that they have to look like the next door guy. You know, they have to look like their uncle, you know.
But how is the culture in the country of Benin? Let's suppose I have a son and I have a nephew who is, you know, much more talented. Would I devote my resources to my son, or would I devote it to the nephew?
You know, that's interesting. equal.
I don't know how is it? Is
more,
it like,
more or less
family perspective that you don't really favor your son over the nephew? Or is...
Yeah. I mean, the main point here, you treat your nephew nearly as well as you treat your son.
Okay. Because
there is a sense, there is, with African families, there is something called, sometimes it's called like the future of the family.
Yes.
Like the future of the family, it doesn't matter whether it's your son or your brother's son.
Okay.
So, and this makes, and in fact, this gives some advantage to the nephew and niece because they don't take anything for granted, So I think I want to show that, in fact, there is a decrease in inequality in community with school. For instance, you see a lot of inequality, first generation between control and treatment, and it flipped completely the third generation, which is really stunning, So education really contributes to not only a reduction there is a reduction in inequality here and increase in inequality in the control places, So, okay, here's what I was talking about earlier. So for instance, you see, I'm going to IV result directly. So you can see that social mobility, the slope of social mobility is positively correlated with self-reliance, work ethics, and life outlook. So clearly, village-treated grandkids, they tend to be more self-reliant, they work harder, and they have more positive life outlook. So it confirmed what I was saying.
It's not clear how the causality goes, no, is it?
I try by IV social mobility with village treatment stuff. Okay. So this one is a correlation, but this one is causality. I mean, to the best that I could. So so to finish, basically, as I told you earlier, we are doing similar project in Nigeria. Interesting here is the importance of religion, diversity, and gender, because the school in Benin were all girls. So this one, I mean, not all boys, I'm sorry. This one is more balanced. And so I talk about the social network mechanism, where, I also talk about the economic mechanism, meaning uneducated getting opportunity to work for the educated, and that boosts education externalities and prospect of their children. Is also the political mechanism. So here is this guy, Bafemi Olowo in Nigeria is a legend in terms of pushing for education in the country. And you have a lot of leaders, in the colonial period who were champion education. And this mechanism helped rapid expansion of education opportunities as well. So, what is interesting about this project is that the policy in Nigeria actually spill over to Benin. Like the impact in Nigeria was so strong that villages in Benin that have connection to Nigeria through roads or market opportunities, they benefited from the policy without being in Nigeria. It's something that we show in the paper. So another project is the story of the Brazilian free slaves who moved back to Benin, and they were the one who, in places that are 100 kilometer. I mentioned dividing Benin into inland, which is 100 kilometers up, and close to the coast. They set up institutions, a lot of businesses, and we want to see the impact of those institutions had on education and education attainment. So, like here is economic institutions with education versus education with less advanced economic institutions. So this will help me to sort of look at the comparative contribution between institution and human capital to colonial development. So this is, for instance, one of the mentions that one of the former slaves coming back to Africa has set up to show how highly successful they were. And, we're able to get their passports. So we have a lot of information. We have the social networks that they have set up from back in data. So I'm looking forward to doing that project as well. And last not least, one important institution in colonial Benin was the Army of Female Warriors. I was able to, I have data in which I have a list of the last cohorts, and they're located across the country. Across at least the central Benin. So I'm trying to look at the impact of their presence in a community on gender norms, education, and so on. And this work landed me a job as a historical advisor to a movie in Hollywood on the story of the female warriors. So anyway, so that's.
So when is the movie coming out?
September.
Okay.
So my name is going to pop up somewhere as historical advisor. So that's going to.
Okay. You have to send me an email when.
Exactly.
When it's out.
Anyway, so the story here is, to circle back to the questions that were asked at the poll. I will say, by and large, colonial expansion was demand-driven, by and large, not supply-driven. Second, I will say that it was at least as much shaped by, social mobility was as much shaped by aspiration that was by income. I will be tempted to say, actually, shaped more by aspiration, especially given the result from the untreated with school group, and what happened to their children and their grandchildren. And then for the last question, I think that given the importance of aspiration, I think one of the important policy recommendations is more investment, at least more than currently is, on higher education and research, because entrepreneurial human capital is very important, as I show. Aspiration is big, as I show. So, and the problem of education in Africa is not access. Girls' access is a big problem. So that's a political problem. That's a policy issue that can be resolved. But overall, Africa is doing well in terms of access, in terms of enrollment. It's the quality which is the problem. So how do you improve curriculum? How do you improve the quality of teachers, all this kind of stuff? This is where the investment need to be. And the decline that we...
That's again supply, I guess.
I'm sorry?
You have to improve the quality of the supply.
Exactly.
But you could also, run an ad campaign to increase this aspiration, but you would put the money on the supply, I guess.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And then, of course, the way you increase employability is not just to give vocational training to people, is to get entrepreneurs in Africa to be very creative, to be very innovative, so that they can compete in the global markets. Like in Kenya today, where they are front in terms of digital finance and stuff. This is how you can actually. So my sense is that, yes, we have to maintain high standard in terms of access. We have to also, diversify the curriculum a little bit by focusing on, by doing some vocational. But I think where we are lacking really behind is on high ed and research. This will boost productivity, boost competitiveness on global markets, but more importantly, given the high aspiration. I remember something that always, I remember all the time is what my mom used to tell me. She said, I don't want you to be successful so that you can help me. I want you to be successful so that you can be my lantern. You can be the person who will help me see the world, So, she was so determined to get his kids to achieve the highest, So the idea that parents are basically very short-sighted, and the poor parents are very short-sighted. They just want their kids to finish school very early so that they can help them get out of poverty. You have to be, you have to take it with a grain of salt, because in fact, given the story I'm telling, is that those who early on were close to a school, close to success, they actually want the best. They want to be at the top. And this culture of excellence is something that we need to nourish, we need to support. And I think it means more education, more investment in higher education and research. Mm-hmm. And it's not necessarily about money, because for instance, investment can be done with partnerships with universities in Europe and US, mobility of researchers based in Africa. It doesn't mean that the government has to be doing all the funding, doing all the financing, so they can find a way to self-finance, But I think the idea that, in Africa, what is needed is the basic stuff, that the practical stuff, I think it's a bad idea.
So coming back to your poll questions, I think probably you shifted the take quite a bit of many of the service.
yeah, exactly.
Because you want to sell dreams, that people dream about their ambitions and their aspirations. Let me ask you a final question.
Yeah.
Do you think in a world where we live with the internet, and I guess many of the people have smartphones, even in villages these days.
Yeah.
That affects aspirations quite a lot. It doesn't not only matter what your neighbor kid is doing or what your neighbor's uncle was doing. You have much more exposure to a much broader circle these days.
Absolutely. So, and I think that, that's why I use the word launcher. Like many people who in colonial times cannot even imagine what life in Paris looked like, or life in Dakar looked like in New York looked like. They have never seen it, they have a dream about it. They can see it. They can see it on the internet. They can see it on their smartphone. They can see so on. So, it's something, what I'm saying is that it's something that we need to nurture, we need to develop. Because
there are some voices which say, because of these aspiration levels, there will be much more migration because.
Yeah, which is, but okay. So, but then, yeah, so it's not, okay, let me put it this way. Migration is one thing, but another thing perhaps is to create, if you people migrate, come to Princeton to get a PhD, and there is, there are opportunities created for them back home, they are going to come back. Like for instance, there is an increasing number of returnees in Nigeria, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Senegal today. Mm-hmm. And, there are a lot of mobility within Africa as well. Like for instance, you find people from Mali working in Angola, people from Senegal working in Kenya, So the point here is that if we want to push for development in Africa, like agriculture, technology, we cannot just be using the technology from the 20th century, from the 20s and 30s, We have to get entrepreneurs at the frontier. And this means that they got to be highly educated, They have to be highly educated. We have to be able to get them to compete. If you do that, and also, one of the things that you mentioned, which is the opportunities for mobility and, spatial mobility, traveling to the US and so on, they can also find partners. Like for instance, you have tech companies in Lagos who have basically, office and operations in Silicon Valley, So they don't have to be, you see what I mean? So one positive, kind of spin to this is let people leave to make sure that there is not good enough opportunities for them to come back to. That's one. But at the same time, if we think that, especially we come to an entrepreneur and they leave and what they do is to build partnerships here, they are successful here, they will almost necessarily invest back home. And being there or here, it's something that will boost growth and productivity in their home country. You know, so this might be provocative here because it's very anti what many international institutions like the World Bank and so on are saying, which is, well, you know, people are not getting jobs, so get them to learn to be a carpenter. You know, well, not, you know. And I wanted to, I'm not saying that this should take 90% of the education budget, but currently it's like near 0% or 3% in many cases. It's bad, you know, because, you know, I mean, I also wanted people to understand that there are so many young Africans like me, you know, who have achieved so much, who are highly ambitious, and this is originated from those colonial times where the parents, despite their conditions, you know, were really, yeah. And I think this is something we need to build on, you know, as opposed to saying, well, you know, things are going nowhere, you are not doing well, so just learn to be a carpenter and then you can feed your family, you know. No. So yeah, it's going to come naturally. Yeah, so
it just shows, you know, how long a horizon the investment is. If you have dedicated teachers, you will affect society over generations.
Exactly. Yeah, and those teachers are not going to be, you know, uneducated teachers. You know, they have to be people who really have a deep understanding of, you know, the curriculum and so on. So I see no future if prospects, if, for instance, and to finish, I'm sorry to be taking the time, but I think this is not different from what China did, right? From even South Korea, maybe you take China, for instance, Deng Xiaoping in the 70s. It's like, send them. How many Chinese Harvard want? Let them get all of them. And he said, if one of them come back, we won, you know, so we will have won, you know, so he was not afraid. He was, if they will never forget, even in the US, that they are Chinese. So they will keep contributing to knowledge and to development in their home country. And if the conditions are good, they are going to come back, you know. So
thanks a lot, Leonard. And I think you're one of them contributing back by having founded the African School of Economics.
Yeah, I hope so.
And giving back this way as well.
I hope so.
Great. Thanks a lot. And I see you around.
Yes, absolutely.
And
thanks so much for the opportunity.
And talk to you soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.